My daughter said something strange on the drive over. She was in the back seat with her seatbelt twisted the way she always wore it, one strap across her chest, one pulled behind her back, looking out the window at the dark. She said, "Mom, do we have to stay the whole time?" I asked her why. She didn't answer. Just looked back out the window. I told myself it was nerves. She was 8. Loud family gatherings made her tired, and my family was nothing if not loud. I turned the radio on low and focused on the road, and I told myself that whatever I was feeling, that low hum of unease I'd been carrying since that morning, was just holiday anxiety. Normal stuff. It wasn't. The thing that started it wasn't dramatic. It was a detail so small I almost missed it. My mother had sent me a text at 10 a.m. that day, "Don't forget 4 o'clock sharp. And tell Mara to dress nicely." That was it. Nothing unusual. My mother had been sending variations of that text for 15 years. But when I was getting dressed, I noticed she'd sent the same message to our family group chat. The whole thread. And everyone had responded, my sister Dana, my brother Ellis, Ellis's wife Patricia, my aunt Carol. All of them confirming they were coming, asking what to bring, the usual. Except my name wasn't in that thread. I mean, I was in the group chat. I'd been in it for years. But the message had gone to the group, and no one had replied to me. No one had said "See you tonight, Claire." No one had tagged me, included me, referenced me. I'd been looped in the way you loop in the dog walker, just so they know to come. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I drove us over. I brought the wine my mother likes, the one I knew from memory because I'd been bringing it for years. I helped Mara out of the car, fixed her coat, told her we'd only stay a few hours, and we walked up the front path. The door opened before I could knock. It was Dana. She looked at me for half a second longer than felt natural, just a half second, then smiled and hugged Mara first. "There she is," Dana said, to my daughter. Like I wasn't there. I walked in. The house smelled like pine and something roasting, and the lights were low and warm, and for a minute it looked like every Christmas I remembered. My mother was in the kitchen. Ellis was by the drinks. Patricia was talking to Aunt Carol near the fireplace. Mara ran to find the dog. I put the wine on the counter. My mother glanced at it. "You didn't have to," she said. Not warmly. Just as a statement. I asked if she needed help with anything. She said no. I stood there for a moment with nothing to do. That should have been my signal. For 15 years I'd been pulling dishes out of ovens and setting tables and refilling glasses, and my mother had always had something for me to do. Always. And that night she was standing in her own kitchen with her back to me, and the food was already done and the table was already set, and she was telling me she didn't need me. I went to find Mara. She was in the living room with the dog, a golden retriever named Chester who was too old and too gentle to be bothered by an 8-year-old pulling gently at his ears. Ellis was watching her from across the room. When I sat down next to my daughter he said, "You look tired, Claire." I told him I'd had a long week. He nodded slowly. "Right," he said. "Just that. Right." Patricia didn't come to say hello. Dana kept touching Mara's shoulder and asking her questions and sort of angling herself between me and my daughter in a way that was subtle enough that I couldn't call it anything. Carol gave me a hug that lasted exactly the right number of seconds, not cold, but not warm either. Calibrated. We sat down to dinner. My mother put the seating out the way she always did, place cards, every year, written in her careful cursive. I found mine. End of the table, near the kitchen. That wasn't unusual. I'd sat there before. But Mara's card wasn't near mine. I found it at the other end. Between Dana and Patricia. I picked it up and brought it over and placed it next to me without saying anything. Dana started to say something and then didn't. Mara didn't notice. She was looking at Chester, who had followed us to the table and was lying under Ellis's chair. Dinner started. It was pleasant, mostly. The food was good. Everyone laughed at the right moments. Carol told a story about her neighbor's cat. Ellis talked about work. Patricia talked about their upcoming trip to Lisbon. No one asked me anything. Not one person at that table asked me a single question. Not about work, Not about Mara, not about how we were doing. They talked near me. They passed food in front of me. But I was being managed, carefully, collectively, the way you manage someone you've already decided something about. I noticed. And then I noticed that I'd noticed. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I picked up my glass. I looked at my daughter, who was cutting her food with concentration and didn't know anything was happening. I looked at my mother, who was laughing at something Ellis said and hadn't looked at me directly in an hour. I thought about what Dana had started to say when I moved Mara's place card. I thought about the group text where no one had replied to me. I thought about the way Ellis had said right when I explained my week. I set my glass down. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. The moment that changed everything wasn't loud. It happened between the main course and dessert, when my mother got up to bring out the pie and Ellis leaned across the table to say something to Dana. Low voice. Quick. He thought I was looking at Mara. I wasn't. I didn't catch all of it. Just the end, before she causes a scene. Dana glanced at me. Not at Ellis. At me. Like a reflex. I kept my eyes on my daughter's plate. I asked Mara if she wanted more green beans. She said no. I nodded and said okay, and nothing in my face moved. But my hands had gone very still. Before she causes a scene. That phrase sat in my chest like a stone. Because it meant they were expecting something. It meant there was a plan, or at least an anticipation, and I wasn't part of knowing about it. I was the subject of it. My mother came back with the pie. She set it in the center of the table, and then she stood there for a moment with her hands folded in front of her, and she said, "Actually, before we do this, I'd like to say something." The table went quiet. Carol set her fork down. Patricia straightened slightly. Ellis sat back in his chair with the posture of someone who already knows what's coming. My mother looked at the center of the table. Not at me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said, "about how we want our family gatherings to feel going forward. About what kind of energy we want in this house." I felt Mara's foot tap mine under the table. She didn't know what was happening. She was just fidgeting. I pressed my foot gently back against hers. "There are certain situations," my mother continued, "that have made people in this family uncomfortable. And I think, we all think, that it might be better if some of those situations weren't present at occasions like this." She still wasn't looking at me. I said, quietly, "Mom." She looked at me then. "Are you asking us to leave?" She took a breath. "I'm saying that things have been tense. And that tonight should be peaceful." "It's been peaceful," I said. "Claire." That was Ellis. Flat and final, the way he said my name when he was done having a conversation. "She's 8 years old," I said. Quietly. Still quiet. "She's been sitting here eating her dinner." Patricia said, "No one is talking about Mara." "Then what are you talking about?" No one answered. That was the answer. I looked at Dana, who was looking at her plate. I looked at Carol, who had the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. I looked at my mother, who had managed to express disappointment, resolution, and discomfort all at once without saying a single direct thing. And I understood. This had been decided before I arrived. The place card at the other end of the table. The group text where no one responded to me. The way Dana had positioned herself. The way Ellis had said right. The wine no one thanked me for. All of it had been a slow, careful setup for this moment. They had been waiting for me to react so they could point to the reaction. I didn't react. I looked at my daughter. She was watching me with wide, quiet eyes. "Okay," I said. I stood up. I got her coat from the hook by the door. I helped her into it. I picked up my bag and her little backpack with the unicorn on it, and I put my hand on her shoulder and I walked us toward the door. My mother said, "Claire, you don't have to make this into." "I'm not making it into anything," I said. And I meant it. I opened the door. Cold air came in. Mara looked up at me. I squeezed her shoulder once, and we walked out. I got her buckled into the back seat. I got in the front. I sat there for a moment with the car running. My hands were still very still. I thought about what had just happened. And then I thought about everything that surrounded it, the things I'd been too close to see clearly until that moment. The reason my brother had been so strange with me for the past 3 months. The conversation I'd overheard in September, at my sister's birthday, where someone had said my name followed by a silence. The way my mother had stopped asking about certain topics. The way the family group chat had gone noticeably quieter after I'd mentioned, once, that I might be looking into how our late father's estate had been distributed. That was it. That was the thread. 6 weeks before my father died, he'd updated his will. I knew this not because anyone told me, but because I'd found the envelope by accident, a copy he'd left with me for safekeeping, in a folder he'd asked me to hold for him during one of his hospital stays. I'd never opened it. I hadn't thought I needed to. After he passed, Ellis had handled everything. He told me the estate had been distributed equally. I had no reason not to believe him. He was the executor. My mother backed him. The paperwork he showed me was 2 pages and clean, and I was grieving and I signed it. But in September, Mara had been doing homework at my desk and she'd pulled that folder out by accident. She'd been looking for printer paper, and she'd set it on the floor and I'd almost thrown it away without looking at it. Almost. It was dated 2 weeks before my father had updated the will Ellis had shown me, meaning there was a version of his wishes that existed before the one that had been used to distribute the estate. I'd had it in my possession for 2 years and hadn't known what I was holding. That night, I got home and put Mara to bed and I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open in front of me. And I read it carefully. And then I read it again. In the original version, dated in my father's handwriting, witnessed by 2 signatures I recognized, I was left the house. Not a share of it. The house itself. The property my mother still lived in. The property that had been in my father's family for 30 years. In the version Ellis had shown me after the funeral, I received a cash disbursement and a 3rd share in a savings account. The house had gone, entirely, to my mother, who had then, within 8 months of my father's death, added both Ellis and Dana to the deed. My name was not on it. I closed the folder. I set my hands flat on the table. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry, not in the way that feels like fire. It was something colder and clearer. They had known. All of them. They had known what that folder contained, and they had known I hadn't opened it, and for 2 years they had managed me, carefully, warmly enough, close enough to keep me from asking questions, and tonight they'd decided they didn't need to manage me anymore. Confronting them would have ruined everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was upset. I was past upset. I was in that place that comes after upset, the quiet, functional place where everything becomes very simple and very clear. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I read the folder again from the first page to the last. Then I photographed every page. 12 photographs, each one crisp and properly lit, saved to my phone and immediately backed up to my cloud account. Then I drove to the 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks away and printed 2 sets of copies. One set went into a new folder. The other went into a padded envelope I addressed to my own P.O. box, a box I'd opened years ago for a freelance project and never closed. I dropped it in the overnight mailbox on the way home. I was back before midnight. Mara was still asleep. I checked on her. She was fine, one arm out of the blankets, her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin. I stood in her doorway for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went back to the table and I started making a list. Not an emotional list. A practical one. What do I have? What do I need? Who can help? The first call I made was the next morning, while Mara was eating cereal and watching cartoons in the other room. I called a lawyer. Not a family friend. Not someone who knew my mother. A probate attorney whose name I'd gotten from a colleague 3 months earlier. Back when I'd first started quietly wondering about the estate, before I'd found the folder, before I'd had anything concrete. I'd kept her number in my phone under a different name. Her name was Helen. I told her I had documentation and I needed to understand what I was looking at. She said to come in Thursday. I said I'd be there. Then I called my office and rearranged 2 meetings. Then I made Mara's lunch. That was the rhythm of those days. The ordinary things and the other things, running in parallel, and nothing on the surface to show which was which. Helen was direct in a way I immediately respected. She read through the copies I brought, asked 4 or 5 precise questions, and then sat back and said, "This is a legitimate prior testamentary document. If it can be established that the version used in probate was executed under any kind of undue influence, or if there are discrepancies in the witnessing, which there may be, given the dates, you have standing." I asked what that meant practically. She told me. I listened. I didn't ask her to explain anything twice. On the drive home I stopped at nothing, said nothing to no one, and thought very carefully about what I wanted. Not what I was owed. Not what would hurt them most. What I actually wanted. I wanted my daughter to have the security my father had intended for her. That was it. That was the whole thing. Over the next 2 weeks I gathered what Helen needed. Bank statements my father had copied for me during his illness. He'd been meticulous, my father, the kind of man who kept records the way other people kept photographs. Emails between us from the year before he died, where he'd mentioned the house specifically, mentioned wanting it to stay in the direct line. A voicemail, still on my old phone, the one in my desk drawer, where he'd said, in his careful measured voice, that he wanted me to have something solid. Something that couldn't be argued over. I charged that old phone in a closet so Mara wouldn't ask questions. Helen also found something I hadn't noticed. One of the 2 witnesses on the updated will, the version Ellis had used, had signed on a date when, according to hospital records Helen obtained through proper channels, that witness had been admitted for a procedure. An outpatient thing, nothing serious, but enough to raise questions about availability and timing. I didn't celebrate. I just noted it. My mother called once during those 2 weeks. Checking in, she said. Warm in the way she became warm when she was uncertain. She asked about Mara. I told her Mara was fine. She said she hoped I understood that Christmas had been tense for everyone and that no one had wanted things to go the way they did. I said I understood. She seemed relieved. I asked how the house was. Just conversation. She talked about the gutters. She talked about the driveway. She talked about it with the comfort of someone who believes completely that what they have is theirs. I said it sounded like she was keeping it up well. She said yes, she thought so. We said goodbye. I set the phone face down on the table and sat there for a moment. Then I sent Helen the notes from the call. Just in case anything became relevant. Helen said probably not, but good practice. Dana texted once. A photo of Chester the dog wearing a Santa hat, sent to the family group chat. Everyone responded. I didn't. 3 days later she texted me directly, "Hope you and Mara are okay. Holidays are hard." I didn't respond to that either. Not out of anger. Just because I had nothing to say that would be true and also harmless, and I wasn't willing to say something false. Ellis didn't reach out. That told me everything about who understood what was happening. 2 weeks after Christmas, Helen filed. Not a dramatic action. Not a scene. A formal legal challenge to the probate distribution, citing the prior document, the witness discrepancy, and the pattern of asset transfer in the months following my father's death. Clean, factual, documented. Served quietly. On a Tuesday morning. I was at work when it happened. I had a meeting at 10 and a sandwich at my desk at noon, and I picked up Mara from school at 3:15 and she told me about a project on ecosystems and I listened carefully and asked the right questions. My phone started buzzing around 4. My mother first. Then Ellis. Then Dana. Then my mother again. I didn't answer. Not because I was avoiding them, there would be time for conversations. But because Helen had been clear, until we reached a certain point in the process, it was better not to engage in informal discussions that could complicate the record. I had a reason for everything now. That was the difference. I made dinner. Pasta, because it was a Tuesday and Mara liked pasta on Tuesdays, and that was reason enough. I helped her with the ecosystem project. There was a section on forests, how they regulate themselves, how they return to balance after disruption. How the process is slow and quiet and looks like nothing from the outside until suddenly it doesn't. Mara read that part out loud to me, very seriously, the way she read everything. I listened. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. The first response came from Ellis. Not a call. A letter, through his own attorney, delivered to Helen's office within 10 days of the filing. It was defensive in the way that letters are defensive when the person writing them knows they don't have clean hands, full of language about the validity of the probate process, the proper execution of documents, the family's collective grief during a difficult time. Helen read it. She said, "They're worried." I said I could tell. She said that was good. The witness discrepancy was the thing that concerned them most, it turned out. Because it wasn't a technicality. It was a verifiable factual problem. Either the witness had signed that document on the date listed, or they hadn't. The hospital record was what it was. You couldn't argue with an admission timestamp. Helen said there were two likely paths. One involved a longer process, depositions, potentially court dates, a drawn-out thing that would be expensive and unpleasant for everyone. The other involved a negotiated resolution. She said in her experience, when families faced the second option and understood the strength of the opposing documentation, they often preferred to resolve things quietly. I told her I preferred quiet too. She said she knew. What followed was 6 weeks of back and forth that I was largely shielded from, by design. Helen handled the communication. I answered questions when she had them, provided documents when she needed them, and otherwise kept living my life in the way I had been. Work, Mara, dinner, the ecosystem project which had expanded into a full poster that now occupied one end of the kitchen table. I didn't speak to my mother during those 6 weeks. I didn't speak to Ellis or Dana. There were more calls I didn't answer. A voicemail from my mother that I listened to once. She sounded tired, and a little frightened, and older than I was used to hearing her, and then saved without responding to. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something more like grief, actually. The slow recognition that the family I'd understood myself to be part of had been, for some time, a slightly different thing than I'd believed. That the warmth had been real enough, but the foundation underneath it had been quietly, carefully arranged in a way that excluded me. That my father had seen it coming. That he'd tried to protect me from it. That the document in the folder, the one Mara had pulled out looking for printer paper, the one I'd almost thrown away, had been his way of making sure I had something solid. Something that couldn't be argued over. Except that it had been. And so I had to argue over it, the way he'd known someone eventually might have to. The resolution came on a Thursday afternoon in late February. Helen called me at work. She said the other side had agreed to terms. I asked what the terms were. She told me. I sat with it for a moment. The house would not change hands. My mother was elderly and it was her home and I had never wanted to take it from her. That was never the point. But the deed would be restructured. Ellis and Dana would be removed. The property would be placed in a trust that named Mara as the primary beneficiary, clearly documented, legally airtight, witnessed properly this time by people who were verifiably present. Additionally, there would be a financial settlement. A portion that reflected the original discrepancy in the estate distribution, not a punishment, just an accounting. The number was not small. I thanked Helen. I said I'd let her know if I had questions. I hung up and sat at my desk and looked out the window at the parking lot for a little while. Then I finished the report I'd been working on and sent it before 5. I picked Mara up from her after-school program. She'd added a section to the poster about wetlands. She was very pleased with it. I told her it looked excellent, and it did. We drove home. I made dinner. She set the table the way she always did, slightly crooked, which I never corrected because she liked to do it herself. At some point during dinner she looked up and said, "Mom, are we okay?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" I said. She shrugged. "I don't know. After Christmas. You've been kind of quiet." I put my fork down. I thought about how to answer honestly without giving her weight she didn't need to carry. "Yeah," I said. "We're okay. We're more than okay, actually." She seemed to consider this. Then she nodded and went back to her food with the seriousness of someone who has decided to believe what they've been told. I watched her for a moment. She had her father's eyes and my father's way of concentrating, that same slight pull at the corner of the mouth when she was thinking. I used to find that bittersweet. That night it just felt like continuity. Like something passing forward the way it was supposed to. My phone buzzed once during dinner. I glanced at it. My mother. I set it face down. Not forever. There would be a conversation eventually. There would probably be several. Things would be different going forward, not broken, maybe, but restructured, like the deed. Reorganized around what was actually true rather than what was easier to pretend. That felt right. Uncomfortable, but right. After dinner I helped Mara finish the wetlands section. We looked up photographs of marshes, of sedge grass, of the way water moves through lowland terrain. She wrote 3 careful sentences in her neatest handwriting and illustrated them with colored pencil, blue-greens, soft browns, a stripe of pale yellow for reflected light. I put her to bed. I read 2 chapters of the book we were working through together, a story about a girl who discovers her grandmother was someone entirely different from who the family believed. Mara found this deeply satisfying. She liked stories where hidden things came to light. I turned out her light. I stood in the doorway for a moment the way I always did. Then I went to the kitchen and cleaned up quietly. Washed the pot, wiped the counter, put the leftover pasta in a container for tomorrow. Ordinary things, done in order, in a clean kitchen. The settlement paperwork would be signed next week. The trust would be established the week after. Mara would never know the details, not for years, maybe not ever. She would simply grow up knowing that certain things were secure. She wouldn't be able to name what she felt. She'd just feel it, the way you feel solid ground without thinking about it. My father had understood that. He'd understood it well enough to put it in writing, in his careful handwriting, on a document he'd asked me to hold and I'd held without knowing. He'd trusted me with it even before I'd known I was carrying it. I turned off the kitchen light. I stood for a moment in the dark hallway, just listening. The house was quiet, the small sounds of Mara sleeping, the hum of the refrigerator, rain starting very lightly against the windows. I hadn't caused a scene. I hadn't made a speech. I hadn't confronted anyone at the table or raised my voice or done any of the things they'd positioned themselves to manage. I just picked up my daughter's coat and walked out into the cold and driven home and sat down at my kitchen table and read a document very carefully. That was all. That was the whole thing. I went to bed. That night, everything was quiet.